Good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. My name is Doug Brunke. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Chamber. We have a very special Globinar podcast today featuring the topic that many of the global tribe are extremely interested in. That's cross-cultural communications. And we happen to have the world's #1 expert. At least she seems like the most impressive person I've met. Somebody who has studied it inside and out. She has her own company, Japan Intercultural. She's expanded beyond Japan even. She knows this topic inside and out. Her name is Rochelle Kopp. And Rochelle, we really appreciate you taking the time today to talk about this topic, especially since, not to date this recording, but it's the first day of the Olympics today, which, many people would think is somewhat great and some might think is somewhat inauspicious given all of the drama and the issues, not unlike, for instance, some of the cross-cultural things that happen in business, right? Sometimes
Right,
it
yeah.
seems like it's a disaster, but by understanding and communicating properly, maybe it all works out in the end, and our fingers are crossed for this Olympics as well. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, glad to be here. Thank you.
You've taken it upon yourself to become an expert on this, not just in the last few years, but really your entire career. And I'm wondering, as I look back at what you've been able to do, I think in your bio, it talks about how you had been working in a Japanese company. And at some point, something clicked with you, it seems, that this was something that you wanted to dedicate your life in and become such a deep expert. What about the topic fascinates you, and how have you kind of gotten to where you are, given your expertise?
Well, I think there were kind of two stages in this, and well, I actually maybe three. And so the first stage was a general interest that I had in Japan and Japanese business that started when I was in high school. My hobby was doing artwork, and I was fascinated by Japanese art. I grew up in Chicago. The Art Institute has a wonderful collection of Japanese art, including lots of beautiful ukiyo-e prints. And I took classes in an artist studio, and there was a Japanese artist who worked there, and her artwork was wonderful, and she was a very interesting person to talk to. I had several friends who were Japanese American, and I would go to their houses, and their parents were really nice, and they had lots of like cool Japanese things around. So I kind of got intrigued with Japan. And at that time, Japan was really very active in the United States. And I had seen somewhere, Pacific Century on the cover of a magazine, and they said that there weren't very many Americans who spoke Japanese. And I thought, oh, well, if I learned Japanese, it would be really cool and interesting, and it could be useful for a future career. So that's how I gotten started with it. And I had done an internship in Japan during college, which was an absolutely fascinating experience. And then after college, I went to work for a consulting firm in my hometown of Chicago. And a very interesting thing happened the first week I was there. They knew when they hired me that I was interested in Japan. And so they invited me to sit in and observe on a sales meeting that the principals of the firm were having with a potential Japanese client that was visiting Chicago. Now, they knew that I had an interest in Japan, and that was enough to get me in to observe the meeting. However, it wasn't enough to prompt them to ask for any advice from me on how to run the meeting. And so I sat in on this meeting, and it was basically like watching a train wreck happen without having any ability to do anything about it. So what the situation was is that these Japanese potential clients were visiting Chicago, but they had a very tight schedule. And so the only time that they were able to come in and visit our firm was at lunchtime. And they had decided to have a working lunch, which, as you know, Japanese don't really do, right? That they always have eating be separate from business, and eating is a time to form personal relationships and have, small talk and get to know people. So none of that. They had a working lunch. Now, typically in Japanese culture, if you were going to have a working lunch, because occasionally it will happen, or if you would have kind of a meal sort of adjacent to a meeting, typically it would be in a bento box, which would be a nice lacquer box, and it has the food laid out in a very nice way, but it's something for each person that's artfully arranged. And you could do the same thing in an American context by having a nice little catered box. You know, a lot of restaurants will do that for you, and even Panera Bread will have something that has, you know, the sandwich and the cookie and the apple and the chips, and it's nicely kind of arranged. You know, something like that works fine. But instead of something like that, they had make your own deli sandwiches. So
Oh
there
my,
was a massive platter of sandwich bread. There was a platter heaped with deli meats, and there was a big fat vat of very mayonnaisey coleslaw and a vat of very mayonnaisey potato salad. And they're like, okay, help yourself and make your sandwiches. And the look of utter confusion and disgust on the faces of the Japanese was, you know, will never forget, right? So right there, they were not off to a good start. Now, the consulting firm that I worked for was founded and run, well, still is. They're a very successful firm, but they were founded and run by two Northwestern professors. And the firm used technology that was based on the research that they had done in their academic work, and they'd spin it off into a commercial enterprise. And so what they did for companies was a little bit complicated, and it involved introducing some basic observations research type concepts. So this is not something that's easy to understand even in your own language. And excuse me. And so it's something that if you were going to be doing it with people who are not native speakers of English, you would want to take particular care. Now, they did realize that it might be helpful to have an interpreter. However, rather than hiring a qualified interpreter, they hired one of their MBA students who happened to be from Japan.
oh boy.
And they did not give him a prior briefing on what was going to be presented so that he would have an opportunity to prepare, but rather they expected him to be able to interpret it right off the top of his head, you know, just cold. And as you might imagine, this didn't work particularly well. And it was slow, and he was having trouble, and it wasn't going well. And when that happened, one of the two principals kind of visibly showed his annoyance and frustration, which again is kind of a no-go in Japanese culture. So I'm watching the faces of the Japanese from the back of the room, and I can tell that we're never going to get any business from these people, and they made the worst possible impression. But I was helpless because my Japanese wasn't good enough for me to be able to jump in and try and help. And as I said, I hadn't been consulted ahead of time because I could have helped them avoid the make your own sandwiches debacle. And I said to myself, okay, if I'm going to do this Japanese thing, I better learn more to be able to be taken seriously and help people avoid situations like this, or be able to jump in and help rescue them. Because if not, I'm going to be like I am right now. I'll be in the room, but then I can't do anything, which is worse than not even being in the room. The word in Japanese, chuto hampa, comes to mind. And I'm not even sure how to say that in English. Chuto hampa means like you're halfway there, but you're not good enough, and it's actually worse than nothing. It's kind of like half done kind of thing. And so I kind of felt like I'm a chuto hampa, and I better learn more or else I'm going to be completely useless. So that really made me think, okay, if I'm going to do something with this Japan stuff, I better actually do something with it so I can be taken seriously. So that was kind of part of what led me a couple of years later, after I had gotten some nice consulting experience under my belt, to then go back to Japan and get a job in a Japanese company. And that was really fascinating. The firm I worked for was a large Japanese bank that had been very domestically focused for its entire history. But due to changes that were happening in the markets, it was the bubble period, and the particular bank type that they were was making a lot of money during the bubble period due to they had monopoly over certain um, types of business areas that were working well. And they were rapidly expanding. They decided to go global. And they had opened offices in London and Paris and Luxembourg and Rome and Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur and Bahrain and Mexico City and Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Atlanta. You know, they were all over the place. All of a sudden, within the space of like a couple of years that they set this whole thing up, and all of a sudden they were employing bankers, professional career bankers in all these cities around the world. And they had hired a bunch of non-Japanese into the head office. I was one of them. And really were not very prepared for managing these non-Japanese. And the non-Japanese were not very prepared for working in a Japanese organization. And, I felt that I was fairly well prepared for this new job. I had studied Japanese in college. I had taken courses on the Japanese economy and Japanese society. I learned a lot about Japan and had done an internship in Japan during college. I thought I was fairly well prepared. But I was finding myself saying, oh, what is going on here in a lot of different situations, because things work so differently than any organization that I worked in previously. And I could see that the various non-Japanese employees were having a lot of confusion about what was happening and what was going on. And so I realized that there were a lot of challenges. Also, I saw that the Japanese who were having to manage the non-Japanese were often finding it very difficult as well. They were equally as frustrated. And being someone who likes to read, I decided to try and do some reading or learn something. That's what I do in life, is when I don't know about something, I go and try and read about it. And this is before the internet, so you couldn't Google it. So I went to the library and the bookstore and tried to read about Japanese organizations and non-Japanese working there. And there really was not very much on this topic at the time. At the time, there were starting to be books about how to do business with Japanese, but they were always aimed at the Western company that was going in and doing a distribution agreement in Japan. So, fly to Japan for a few days, negotiate and leave kind of thing. And so that was the level of the information that was out there. And I said, that's not enough for when you're trying to operate in a Japanese organization. In my situation, I was in a position that was newly created, and I was supposed to be making things happen and getting things done. Well, how do you get things done in a Japanese context? It works differently. There was no guidebook. And so even though I tried to find something, and I ended up just learning a lot of things the hard way and making a lot of mistakes to my ever, sort of patient boss, who would try and help me understand where I had messed up. And after a while, I thought, Japanese companies are rapidly expanding around the globe. It's just not the one I'm working for. It's a whole bunch of other ones too. And they're setting up factories all over the place, and they're buying companies, and there are going to be a lot more non-Japanese and Japanese experiencing the same kind of challenges that I and my colleagues are facing. And I thought, if everyone else has to learn it the hard way, the way I am, that is a lot of pain for a lot of people. So I thought, well, this is perhaps some place where I can make a contribution. And if I can help spare some people some of the pain that I've had to go through, then that could be a worthwhile contribution that I could make to the world. So that's really how I got into this area.
It's awesome that you saw that. I was thinking about, that it really took, you stepping back a little bit and seeing that, this is something that impacts a lot of people, rather than just solving your own personal issues, right? With understanding it and being effective. Because I know my own personality is, it's like, I just want to understand how best to be as effective as possible, but not take it to that next level. So kudos to you for seeing that overall need, and the world is better for it. So thank you. That's great. So you finished up at the bank then? Like, what happened then with
Okay, so
there? Because at some point you moved into academia, I believe, right? Weren't
well,
you working as a
here's
professor?
the story. Yes, so I worked at the bank in Tokyo for 2 years. I had always wanted to get an MBA. So I went back to Chicago and I
Uh,
got an MBA at
okay,
the University of Chicago.
got it.
While I was there, I started to do independent research. I had a sort of an independent research project with working under a professor, where I started to look at Japanese multinationals and whether they had different issues or did things differently than American and European multinationals. So I did an international comparative survey where
Wow.
I sent questionnaires, and back again, this is pre-internet, so it was all snail mail. But I sent questionnaires to multinationals in the U.S., Europe, and Japan, and got people to answer questions about their practices in in the international human resource area, as well as their challenges. And I was able to document that Japanese firms were indeed doing things differently, that in particular, they tended to send more expatriates abroad
Yep.
than American and European multinationals were. And if you kind of look at, which I did, the history of multinationals early on, so we'll say, let's say in the 70s, American multinationals had the same issue where they would just send tons of people abroad. And they eventually moved into bringing locally hired people into key positions in their overseas operations. And so, as if since Japanese multinationals kind of got a later start, they were still in this mode of primarily sending their own people. But there isn't just a time lag difference. Also, there's the issue for Japanese firms of how they manage human resources, how they run decision making, which all tend to favor having people from the center go out to different locations, because that's what they do in Japan as well, actually, too. And so they kind of started treating the overseas operations just like their Japanese domestic operations, that it's all centralized in Tokyo or Osaka, and then people go out from there. So I based on this research, I did an academic paper. It was published in an academic journal. And I also started to do a lot of kind of interviews with Americans working at Japanese firms in the US, as well as Japanese managers at Japanese firms in the US. And on the basis of that academic research and then the more qualitative research, I ended up doing a book. Actually, it was two books. They were kind of twins. Um, or I guess we call them fraternal twins. And one was in Japanese and one was in English. The English one is called The Rice Paper Ceiling: Breaking Through Japanese Corporate Culture, where I talked about Japanese multinationals, what was different about them, what are their challenges. And then if you are a non-Japanese person working in a Japanese organization, how can you be effective and what are the chances to be able to rise to higher levels in the organization? So I did that while I had another consulting job after business school. So I kind of started that project in business school and then continued it while I was working a consulting job. So evenings and weekends, I'd be working on my book project. And then when it was ready to all be published, I realized that it made sense for me to go out on my own, that there would be consulting opportunities that would flow from that, and that didn't really work within the structure of where I was working. I was working at a specialized consulting firm in a completely different area, intellectual property. And so that it didn't make sense to try and do my thing within their structure. I really needed to go out on my own and to do things sort of my way and do them effectively. So that's when I started Japan Intercultural Consulting. So that was started in July of 1994. I discovered that it was just a few days after Jeff Bezos started Amazon. like 3 days afterwards or something like that. Because this year they talked about the anniversary, and so yeah, about when
Nice.
it was, and yeah, exactly. So just very shortly after he had started Amazon, and when we first started the firm, the focus was in the United States on Japanese firms, and started out because I was based in Chicago, working with a lot of Japanese auto parts manufacturers and
Okay.
then auto manufacturers, right? And so we've got lots of those in the Midwest, and so I've spent a lot of time in factories, and which have kind of very fascinating cultural issues because they're places where people from the two cultures work together extremely closely, right? So
Yep.
that was the start. And then as time went on, we started getting hired by electronics firms, by pharmaceutical firms, by Japanese trading companies and banks in the United States, machine tools, games. So lots of different industries, but still auto is a key sector for our firm. And
And
then
that
as time
included, did that include then helping with factory floor issues? And because you basically started out at more at the executive level, right? Of kind of one of those old style of somebody comes in, you have a meeting, but that what you're talking about there is really some significantly, organization wide issues that you were
Right,
dealing with.
exactly. Yeah, and so
Wow.
we ended up working on things like those. And so, yes, doing a lot of work with people on the factory floor
Wow.
and doing a lot of work with the management teams in factories, right? So the people supervising the people on the floor. So from executive work all the way down to factory floor work, we kind of work with all different levels of organizations.
Only Japanese companies to that point?
Well, initially it was just Japanese companies, and then as time went on, we also started to work with non-Japanese firms that were selling to Japanese companies or that had Japanese operations. Because as I said, kind of initially back, like sort of the late 80s, a lot of the foreign firms in Japan were using distributors. They'd fly in, set up their deal, fly out. But over time, more and more foreign firms started their own operations in Japan, which means they were hiring lots of Japanese people. And so then you have a lot of the mirror images of, with Japanese firms, it's often Japanese managers managing people from other cultures. But then you have people from other cultures in Japan managing Japanese, which has kind of a mirror image set of issues to it, right? And so we do a lot of work with that in that area. And then over time, we opened up branches in different locations. So in 1999, we opened up a branch in Japan, focusing on working with Japanese firms' headquarters as well as with foreign firms' Japanese operations. We also opened up a branch in Europe. And so my colleague Penilla coordinates the work there. And so I always joke that she's like my sister who happens to be British, because she's like me in so many ways. And she worked for Mitsubishi Corporation, a large Japanese trading company, for many years, both in their London office and at their headquarters in Tokyo. So she and I have kind of parallel lives in a lot of ways. And so she runs our European operations. And so there we work with a lot of European firms that are doing business in Japan, as well as with Japanese companies' operations in various parts of Europe. And we also have a team in Latin America. And so there are a lot of Japanese factories in Mexico. And so we have also a specialty in work, or expertise in working with Japanese factories in Mexico and some of the issues that happen there in the shop floor environments. And so Sarah on my team is trilingual in English, Japanese, and Spanish. And so you can imagine that comes in really handy for our work with clients in Mexico. And we have a great team in Mexico, as well as we have people in Brazil and also Argentina. So we're able to help with Japanese firms in various different locations. And
So
also in Asia, we handle a lot of Asia stuff out of Japan, because we have experts on China and India and Southeast Asian countries in our Japan office, but also we have someone in the Philippines and someone in Australia as well, and also someone in New Zealand. So.
Okay, so you do other country cultures as well.
Well, yes. Well, in two different ways. Originally, and all the ones that I just listed were people in different cultures, different countries, working with their culture and Japan interface. So our team in Mexico works with how do Mexicans interact with Japanese culture? How can Japanese interact with Mexicans? Our team in Germany does how to work with Germans for Japanese and how to work with Japanese for Germans, right? And so in each place, we'll focus on that kind of cultural interface. Or in a lot of cases, we have things that go several ways. So for example, we have one client that is doing R&D, and they're doing it in 3 different locations: the US, Netherlands, and Japan. And so with our local facilitators in each of those locations, we have the same training program that we're offering to all of their people. So all of the people on the global team are getting the same training from a local facilitator. So we do things like that.
Gotcha.
The other thing that I can mention is that a couple of years ago, our firm took over the operations of Caris Intercultural Consulting. So Caris was a firm that was started about the same time as ours, maybe a couple years earlier, run by interculturalist named Marion Stetson Rodriguez. And so she is Silicon Valley based and worked with many major Silicon Valley companies and specializing in cross-cultural training for a variety of different cultures. And she decided that she wanted to retire. And so our firm has taken over their operations. And so with that, we have their team of facilitators. So we are able to offer sort of general working globally, as well as working with specific cultures for a variety of different cultures to clients in the US and elsewhere.
And fantastic. One of the things I wanted to cover today was for the CEO or the appropriate person, I'll leave it more general, within a company that is doing work. Let's say it's an American company in Japan or a Japanese company in the US or anywhere to anywhere. At what point should an executive reach out to get help? The joke that we passed back and forth was one of my friends who is a member of Global Chamber, is working with a company in the US that was going to start work in Taiwan. And he asked me, hey, they're working in Taiwan. Is there like some sort of a help that they can get? Like, is there a company that can help them understand what's involved with that? Is that a thing? That was his question. And I said, yes, that happens to be a thing. So
yep.
What is that thing? What do people buy? And when should they be buying it? When should they know that, hey, we need to do something?
The typical thing that we offer people is a seminar. And if you're like that company that's about to start working with people from a different culture, I would recommend that you get some training as soon as possible. Yeah. Before you've had a chance to make any mistakes that you can't recover from, right? You want to get off on the right foot. Exactly.
Before you even sign the contract. I mean, they actually signed a contract and they probably had no idea, right? So they waited way too long. It's like, no, we have an agreement and now we're sending people over. Maybe we better know a little bit about their culture.
Right, exactly. You definitely want to know something before you send people. Unfortunately, I see so many companies that don't do training. And they send people on business trips, or they even send people on international assignments with no training, which to me is just amazing, because when you're sending people on a business trip or you're having them move somewhere overseas, as a company, you're making a tremendous investment. And also those individuals are making a personal investment too of their time. And particularly if someone's moving, they're disrupting their life, right? So it makes sense to do everything you can as a company to make sure that you are maximizing the potential that it will be successful, right? And so in the context of, how much you might be spending to be, sending someone on a business trip or having them move, what it costs to do a training is a very minimal expenditure compared to your overall investment. And it can make the difference between it working and not working. Same goes through for mergers and acquisitions. There is a lot of research that shows that even between companies from the same culture, that most mergers and acquisitions that fail do so due to cultural differences. And if it's from the same country, it's corporate culture differences. But if you layer those corporate culture differences on top of national culture differences, you have a really sort of recipe, really, really strong recipe for having issues. And I see mergers and acquisitions that happen where companies have spent literally millions of dollars, in some cases billions of dollars, to do an acquisition, and of a country in of a company in a different country, and they don't invest in any cross-cultural training for their team members.
Yeah.
And particularly, the last 15 years, my US base has been Silicon Valley. And in Silicon Valley, I've just seen some really, I find it just gut-wrenching examples of Japanese companies that have done acquisitions in Silicon Valley, did not do cultural training, or didn't do it soon enough or to the right people, and had their the acquisitions fail, and they end up closing the company that they acquired. I
Wow.
mean, wasting literally millions of dollars. It's incredible. And I'm like, okay, could have helped with that.
So
It's very frustrating.
certainly with anything M&A related, or you're looking for an acquisition, that's a signal that you should get help, right? I mean, that would be, what are some of the other signals that should inspire someone to say, maybe we need a little bit of help here? What are, besides M&A, I think expat assignments you mentioned, I think to some extent,
expat
right?
assignments, sort of a new client or a new supplier or a new partner that's from another culture that you're going to need to be working closely with. Anytime that happens, that's when you want to start to get prepared, right? So that, starting any kind of new venture or new relationships or new business activity that involves, people from another culture, that would be an important signal. Also, if you are already in that situation, but you are encountering issues. So, for example, one client we worked with was a firm that had been acquired by a Japanese company 20 years ago prior. And when that acquisition had been done, there hadn't been any cross-cultural training. There hadn't been any cross-cultural training the whole time. The company was experiencing a lot of issues and challenges, and they realized that some of them were due to poor communication with their parent company. And we went in and started working with them, and there was a backlog of 20 years of buildup. It's like if you were a plumber and went into a pipe and it was kind of encrusted with stuff, right? So there was a lot of things that just needed to be worked through that had built up. So while the best thing is to sort of do preventative and not let anything build up like that, sometimes you may already have been in the relationship for a while and there are issues, and it makes sense to go back and clear some of that out that may have built up, and prepare to have things go more smoothly in the future, right? The other thing that I think firms need to be thinking about is, now we've got global companies, and so maybe your interactions with people from other cultures aren't with customers or suppliers, but they could be with people from your own firm, right? And so your own firms oversee subsidiaries, right? And so we do a lot of work with firms, and so helping them coordinate between people who are working in different locations. And so, for example, I recently did work with the Japanese subsidiary of a firm that's based in the Netherlands. And there's also regional management that are based in Singapore. And so was coordinating with people in the Netherlands and in Singapore and Japan, and helping the people in Japan look at how to work with, they had some non-Japanese who were working in Japan. They had to interact with people in Singapore a lot. They often had to interact with people in the Netherlands. Those were a bunch of different cultures that they were dealing with. And so helping the Japanese think about how to be adjusting in different circumstances with different colleagues who had different backgrounds. So we do a lot of things like that within one company where you're working with across locations. Also with a lot of our customers, and we see this with a lot of our firms in the United States and also in Europe, this is a big thing. And it's starting to be more so in Japan, where you have people from various different countries as their backgrounds who are working in one location, right? So now in Europe, you will people, because people are move across the EU, you can have in one place in Europe, you can have people from half a dozen different countries working together. In the United States, because we attract talented people from all around the world, I can be working with a firm in Silicon Valley, and the participants are from India and China and Peru and Brazil and Portugal. They'll be from all sorts of different places, Germany, all in the same room, a whole group of people with varying different backgrounds, right? And also recently in Japan, we find that a lot of our clients in Japan that are doing cutting edge software programming type work are hiring a lot of people globally.
Yep.
So it may be a Japanese company, but then they've got a team of people from all over the place. I mean, I've got clients in Tokyo that the room looks like the United Nations, and I'll ask the managers in my sessions, so where do your subordinates come from? And they're like, well, I'm Japanese, and I've got 2 Japanese team members and 16 people from other countries. So I'm getting a lot of situations like that now, where there's a lot of non-Japanese talent in Japan that people are working with closely.
So it kind of begs the question then, are certainly some of the people that you're dealing with are not really Japanese anymore or American anymore. There's some sort of their own, maybe it goes back to your point about they've developed their own culture, and it could
Right.
have multiple elements of different national cultures within their corporate culture. And so part of what
Right.
you navigate and your team navigates is understanding some of that, where they are. And you've got somebody from Ukraine, you've got somebody from all these different countries. You're trying to get your head around. You can't create now suddenly, hey, this person now can only be given Ukrainian type of stuff, right? They have to meld into this pot. And so
Right.
you're probably seeing a lot more and more of that.
Well, that's true. You're right. So I think there's 2 really important things in what you just said. One is that you've got diverse teams that need to figure out how to work together when people on the teams have various different personal backgrounds and preferences and styles, right? So we do a lot of work helping those teams. But the other important thing in what you just said is that we also have to be careful not to treat people as stereotypes. Because even within one culture, you're going to have, I'm going to say a little, make with my hands a bell curve here. You have a variety of people within a certain culture. So for example, certainly all people from the United States are not all the same. And every person you meet from China is not going to be the same. There's going to be varieties within cultures, just naturally. But also, we have people now who themselves are multicultural, that people who have either different experiences of living in different places. So you may have someone who's originally from Bolivia, but they've worked 10 years in the United States and then 5 years in Japan. And so then they're going to have a variety of different influences on their style. There are also people who moved at a younger age And so maybe it's a Japanese person, but then they went to the United States for high school and college, and then now they're back in Japan, right? So there's a lot of different people who have a variety of different experiences and influences. And so one thing that we do in our sessions is that we use cultural dimensions. So these are scales where you will look at opposite things on opposite side of the scale. So you might have risk seeking versus comfortable with risk. You might have direct communication versus indirect communication. You might have very hierarchical versus very egalitarian. So we have all these scales, and we help people put themselves on the scale using some quizzes that we have. So rather saying, well, you're American, you must be right here on the scale. Well, who are you as a person, and what is your personal style? Because the first step to be able to work effectively with people from another culture is to be aware of what your own personal cultural style is. Then where you know where you are, then you can sense, oh, here's where the gaps between myself and another person. And then you can start to think about, well, what might I want to do to be bridging those gaps, right?
Got it. You know, we've spoken here now for quite a number of minutes, and one of the things that I thought was going to come up prior to this was gender and gender balance. You as a woman, you know, especially in that, even probably as early as that first train wreck that you witnessed, recognize that women have a different place in the Japanese society historically, and that's evolving, but certainly somewhat glacially, perhaps maybe more accelerated now. I don't know. How does that play into the work that you and your team does relative to whether it's US, Japan, or other cultures that have different gender definitions, maybe is one of the ways. How do you deal with those kinds of things, especially when you're bringing people together that might have different thoughts about gender and other issues related to interpersonal relationships?
Right. Well, I think the first thing I'll mention is that our firm does do a lot of work for our Japanese clients on topics along these lines. And so since our establishment have always done sexual harassment and discrimination prevention seminars. And so, I don't know, we're probably one of the firms that has the longest history at this point, 27 years of doing sexual harassment and prevention seminars in Japanese. And so we have a really good sense of how to be effective doing that. And so that's just a long time offering that we've had. More recently, I've been doing some work. I'm very interested in the concept of servant leadership, and I've been doing a lot of servant leadership training for Japanese managers. I find that servant leadership is particularly appealing to Japanese female managers. And I've done, servant leadership sessions for female participants. And I found that in talking with them, a lot of women in Japan feel, I don't want to manage the way that I was managed by my male bosses. I want to have a leadership style that's my own, that's different. And they're looking for a model for that they feel comfortable with. And so I find that the servant leadership one is one that often Japanese female leaders feel more comfortable stepping into as a model that they can relate to. So we've been doing work with that. It's been an issue of kind of long-term interest for me. At the same time, I always want to encourage people to be careful. As you just described, I think that there's an awareness outside of Japan of gender issues there. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that, for example, an American woman can't work with the Japanese. I think I actually have an example that you can, right?
Exactly.
That I think that it's really important to not make assumptions, right? And I think when I look at a lot of the media coverage outside of Japan about gender issues in Japan and the Japanese workplace, it's often very, very simplistic and doesn't understand a lot of the issues that are happening. I actually did a roundtable a few years ago with our clients in Japan. It was at a time when kind of this issue was getting renewed attention, and I wanted to kind of get the feel from my clients of kind of what was on their minds. And so I had in the room HR people from a variety of large Japanese companies and also large foreign firms in Japan. And all names you would know. I don't feel at liberty to share them, but you would be familiar with them. I'll just tell you that. And I asked them, kind of what do you feel are the real issues for promoting more women in your workplaces, or just issues in general? And really, the very strong message I got from them was that a lot of the outright kind of discrimination is much, much less in Japan. The no, we won't hire women for this, or no, we won't promote women, or that kind of thing is it's a lot harder to find. I mean, there's still some of it, but there's much, much, much less than there used to be. What they felt was the real issue was sort of the way that systems are set up from a male-centric point of view. So, the assumption that people can work out late, whereas that doesn't work if you're a woman who has small children, right? The assumption that a lot of Japanese companies have, or there's actually a requirement if you're going to be on the management track, that you be willing to move anywhere at the drop of a hat, which, for understandable reasons, women with children are probably going to, or actually even if without children, there's women who are married to someone, are not going to be as interested or willing to do, right? And so, I mean, that requirement would be something that in the US we would say is illegal for disparate impact, but it's legal in the in Japan. So there's a lot of things where just expectations of how you work and how work is designed is based on the sort of the assumption of the standard employee being a male employee. And so they felt that that was the much bigger issue for them than outright gender bias, right? Okay. And that's harder to change, and it's more subtle, and it doesn't make a great newspaper headline. But I just encourage people to be careful that what you've read about Japan might not be telling the whole story.
Got it. And is part of that also the companies attracting better talent? And given that people are changing, certainly, even in Japan, right? Young people have a different expectation around work and balance, family work balance, that kind of thing. That's changing in Japan as well.
Right, that's changing. And you're right, a lot of younger Japanese really don't want to get into that workaholic pattern that they saw their parents in, right? And so that is something that people are looking for more in choosing jobs, right? And it's on people's minds. And, one of the key things we're going to see in Japan is already happening, and it's going to become worse, is scarceness of talent. And so if companies want to be attracting and retaining people, they're going to need to be more responsive to those new demands, right?
Sure. So I think one of the things you've clearly illustrated here is just picking US, Japan, there's nearly an infinite number of ways you can wreck the train on almost yes. everything. And so that relates a little bit to one thing that I did want to bring up and ask you about, and that is how prolific you are in documenting information. I mean, I don't know how many books you have, but I know I've seen, like in LinkedIn, many times you're saying, oh, my book about such and such is now available by whatever. I don't think it's the same book that you're recycling over and over again. My sense is that you're someone who is constantly absorbing information on all these different things and then documenting and giving your opinion and giving your thought, not just in textual books like a textbook, but also in a variety of ways in, I think, newspaper, right? Yomiuri, right, or
yes,
whatever.
Yes. Yes, I do several columns for Japanese publications, so I write regularly. Excuse me. I have a regular column that I've had for 10 years in the Asahi Shimbun. I
Okay.
also write for the Nikkei Sangyo, which would be like the equivalent of the Wall Street Journal. I also have a new column that I started in HR Pro, which is a well-known portal for HR managers. It's kind of irregular, but I do write for Newsweek Japan's website and the Japan Times, which is an English language.
My
And
favorite newspaper of all time. I love the Japan Times. I read it
they do
almost
a
every.
great job. They do a really
Yeah.
great job, don't they? My
Uh,
editor there is fabulous. And also I write for Teikoku Data Bank, which is kind of like the Dun and Bradstreet of Japan. I write something for their internal customer focused magazine. So I do
you
a
said-
lot of writing. Yes, I like to write, so that's fine.
what keeps you going? I mean, is it just constant? I mean, because of all these changes, you want to stay current? I mean, what drives you these days?
Well, I definitely like to stay current, and there's a lot going on. And so, in the past year, I've been, of course, fascinated by the coronavirus and then, how society and businesses react to that. So I've been doing a lot of that with that. And so I just, I love knowing what's happening. I love responding to it. And the more I understand what's going on in the world, the more that I can help my clients to deal with it. And so, for example, in this past year with remote work and challenges with that, and there's some cultural differences and challenges with remote work. So helping clients with that has been really interesting. So, my role is just to be useful. And part of the way I'm useful is by just being on top of what's happening.
Very, very impressive. What's next? What is it that you want to be involved in kind of in the next phase? Is it more of the same, or do you have some other aspirations?
Definitely more of the same. So I'm really enjoying all the stuff that I'm doing and love helping clients. And so just want to keep doing that.
You mentioned Silicon Valley earlier. Prior to the pandemic, I think you were mainly based there, right? But then during the pandemic, you ended up in Fukuoka, and maybe now you're in Tokyo. So you have kind of certainly a mainly Japan US focus at this point in terms of lifestyle.
Right, that's correct. Yeah, and before the pandemic, I was kind of going back and forth, and recently in spending increasing amounts of time in Japan because I'm also independent board member for 2 Japanese companies, and they like you to be in Japan for that. It's just logistically makes more sense. And so I've been spending increasingly amounts of time in Japan due to that. But then with the coronavirus, I'm just kind of staying put here for now.
Oh, so
My
you are going
US,
to stay
but
there.
yeah, but for a while, I'll have this be my primary base for the time being. And my US base is Silicon Valley, yes, and I have a home there.
Okay, very good. Well, I hope to see you there someday. I would imagine eventually it will pass, and you'll be able to get back and forth.
Well, I think we're all looking forward to the day when that happens, right? We don't know when it's going to be though, but.
Well, I was just on a Zoom call to Australia, and I think maybe recently Brisbane was announced as the Olympic site for 2032, and
Yes,
somebody was joking that the Australian Prime Minister had announced that they expect to have COVID under control by the opening games of in Brisbane. So hopefully it's way before that.
Yeah,
Certainly.
really.
And I think hopefully we can expect that. And so I would say, I mean, just amazing work that you're doing, just so impressive. There's so many levels of knowledge that you need to have just even between 2 cultures, let alone, 195 countries, and then having even multiple cultures often within those countries. So we do need to wrap it up. I'd love to go for the next several hours and just kind of keep going, but maybe just in conclusion, let us know, in terms of the things that you've seen in your career and in your life, how do we help companies more? What would you like to see more from executives that are either in Japanese companies or American companies or in other companies? What would you like them to do more and more of so that we can be more successful and have less train wrecks?
Right. I think really the basic thing is to realize that culture is a thing, that it is important, that it can make a really big difference. So it's something important to learn about and be as prepared as possible.
One of my own learnings after spending time and working in Japan for several years was coming back, and then it was with the DuPont company, a chemical company, and then we did an acquisition where part of the Dow chemical company was merged in. And so everybody thought, well, gee, here's two chemical companies just merging in is like no big deal. You alluded to this earlier about corporate culture. It turned out there were quite a number of differences just between two similar companies. They had different cultures. And so I would think that what you're finding, or what you found over the last 20 plus years, is that people are more sensitive, not just to country cultures, but also to corporate cultures. I hope that's the case. And so what you're saying is people, whether it's a merger and acquisition, whether it's a deal, whether it's a multinational team that you're leading, these are all good reasons to get engaged with you.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because those are all places where we can help.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. What's the rest of the day look like? Are you going to watch any Olympics today or in the next 17 days?
Probably not, because I don't have a TV. I don't sit around and watch TV ever, so I'm probably not going to be. I'm actually gonna get out of Tokyo this evening because the infection numbers are rising here, and I'd like to just not be around. So I'm gonna.
Oh my! And no one's allowed, even nationals, to attend the events.
No, you can't attend events anyway. So.
Oh my.
The aerial, the Japanese equivalent of the Blue Angels flew over my place 2 days ago in their practice run. So I might get to see them again this afternoon when they do the real thing. Sort of on their way to the Olympic Stadium, they went over my place. I got a couple good pictures, but
well, hopefully
that might be about it.
No cultural faux pas. One of the great things about Olympics is that you get all these people together it typically is a kumbaya type of a situation, and unfortunately we're probably not going to get as much of that as we really
we aren't. Yeah.
So let's go to the next Olympics. But thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy. You probably have about 5 articles that you have deadlines on coming up.
I do.
But definitely,
I do. So.
Definitely have Rochelle Kopp in your Rolodex, and Japan Intercultural and the intercultural work that they do with all different sorts of cultures, including in Taiwan and others. Rochelle, thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thanks so much. Always great talking with you.
Have a good rest of your day. Thanks everybody for joining us. Bye-bye.